Down 10, halfway through the third. Need something to happen.
Look out. Stroud, end zone,
Oh, Carlton.
Intercepted. Carlton Davis.
Nice
comes
play.
up with the pick.
He was huge.
Another big play on this night. Turnover.
This
filled.
dive.
Sixth turnover of this game.
Solid
Pretty
pick,
play by
Carlton.
Davis to go up, undercut it, and get the pick.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
The Detroit Lions are now in full off-season mode. They've replaced both offensive and defensive coordinators, and now it's time to look at that roster. Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, Johnny Gaz. Thank you for returning for another video. Let's dive into the Lions free agents as we head into this 2025 offseason. We'll take a look at each individual free agent coming up, and we'll determine if they should stay or if they should go. Let's go. The Lions are in very good cap position as they head into the 2025 offseason, and they'll have to take a look at some upcoming contracts and make some big decisions, and we'll talk about some players that are currently under contract that might be due for extension on future videos. Today's video will focus on the upcoming free agents as we enter 2025. So a player like Zadarius Smith, who is actually under contract for an additional year, the Lions may have to restructure or ultimately cut him or do other things if the dollar amount just doesn't make sense moving forward. Again, something we will get into in a future video. But let's dive into each individual free agent. They fall into 4 different categories. We'll talk about each one and then hit on each player, and I'll tell you whether they should stay or if they should go. Let me first start by shouting out the Pride of Detroit website. They do a fantastic job of breaking down, in their opinion, the priority list of all of these free agents, so definitely go and check them out. Now, the Lions have 4 different categories of free agents. Of course, the unrestricted free agents, which we'll go through in detail. Then you have your restricted free agents, your street free agents, as well as your exclusive rights free agents, and we'll talk about them in detail as we get into this list. Let's first start with the street free agents. These are guys that can sign outside of the organization immediately. They are under no restriction to the Lions. And they're also players the Lions decided not to sign to future contracts. All of these gentlemen were on the practice squad as we ended this last season. Running back Jermar Jefferson, I think, is kind of just in a stronghold in a deep room for the running backs, and I think that's why you didn't see him get any more play on the roster. Wide receiver Maurice Alexander, as well as Donovan Peoples-Jones, just did not provide enough production for the Lions to move them up the depth chart or ultimately use them outside of specialized situations. Donovan Peoples-Jones especially was very disappointing. I thought I saw bigger things for him in the 2024 season. We just didn't get that. And then Quan Alexander was one of the late season pickups. I think, again, it's just one of those players you had to have a body for the depleted defense, and it's a guy that they are comfortable allowing to look elsewhere. The Lions then have 4 exclusive rights free agents, and these are guys that we expect to come back. They're only able to negotiate with the Lions so far this offseason, and they're guys that played pivotal depth roles here at the end of 2024, like a linebacker, Trevor Nowaski, the interior lineman, Michael Neese, who can kind of shift between guard and center. Mitchell Agudi got some play on the edge with the depleted front line there for the Lions, and then tackle Connor Galvin is kind of that depth piece they're hoping to grow into that depth on the offensive line. Again, guys that I think didn't necessarily make a difference, and you're certainly not expecting them to jump in any sort of starter role, but would be good depth pieces moving forward for the Lions. I expect all 4 of them to come back. Now we'll look at the restricted free agents, and these are guys that the Lions have to decide ultimately to tag or tender, which is usually at a higher price than they're willing to pay, or then negotiate a different style of contract at a much lower price, and that's probably the case for all of the 5 players we're about to go over. Let's start with Miles Adams, who kind of played, and they really, I think, we're just trying to get something out of him on a small set of plays defensively to make a difference, and I thought he did okay. He was good for the scheme, but I just think ultimately I don't think the Lions will be interested in bringing him back. I think they'll get enough back defensively from injured reserve, as well as some other pieces they may want to bring in where he then falls off. You then have a guy like linebacker Anthony Pittman, who is a local. He's a native to Detroit in the Michigan area, and he's a good depth linebacker. He's great in special teams. So if the price is right, I could see him coming back, especially with Kelvin Shepard and his familiarity with the linebacker unit. That is certainly a guy I could see the Lions returning. Then you have guard Coyote Awasika, who in the past was really a go-to for Lions depth on the offensive line. He actually played in the NFC Championship game last year that they lost. Well, you saw as we got towards the end of the season, a guy like Christian Mahogany really superseded Awasika. Does that then mean he falls out of Lions' favor this offseason? Certainly has potential. They have guys like Michael Neese and some other offensive line depth that they can lean on here. So that might be a player that the Lions move away from. Then you have tight end Shane Zylstra, sort of your third tight end. He has paid dividends in the right role at the right time. You see him play sort of an H-back sometimes. He's used in so many different formations in the Ben Johnson offense. But will that be needed as John Morton then takes over as the offensive coordinator? And that's the real question. Do they have a need for a tight end 3? And again, does the price make sense for what they're willing to pay for a third tight end? I like Shane Zylstra. I think the organization likes him. I think if the price is right, they do bring him back and solidify the tight end room. And then we have running back Craig Reynolds, who we know the Lions organization loves, and that's partly why a guy like Jermar Jefferson sort of may fall off, because the Lions have a lot of faith in him to fill out that running back room and ultimately make it one of the best running back rooms in the NFL. So I do see the Lions bringing him back under a smaller contract. Now let's move into the unrestricted free agents, and the Lions have an extensive list, 21 players currently unrestricted free agents, and the Lions have a history of signing back about half of them, and it's all going to be based on if the price is right as we get into any of these players. Let's first start with backup quarterback Teddy Bridgewater. I think the Lions love Teddy. It's clearly shown that they had faith in him as they used him as the backup to Jared Goff in the loss in Washington, where he actually filled in pretty admirably. So I think if the price is right, they absolutely will bring him back, and they might even be grooming him to be a coach down the line here. Kicker Michael Badgley, I think we know the Lions have moved on. They found their kicker. I think, unfortunately, he was a casualty. Once that injury occurred early on, they brought in Jake Bates, and everything seemed to work out there. Cornerback Emmanuel Mosley, I think everything was sort of set in stone for him once they didn't really bring him back to any sort of action once he got healthy. I think not only did he have the physical injury, but he had an illness along with some other things going on where the Lions just were not comfortable to insert him even in situations where they needed the depth. So unfortunately, he is another player that I could see leaving the organization. Defensive lineman Jonah Williams, who they brought in midseason again to help recover from the injured reserve and all the defensive depth issues they're having. Filled in well, wasn't fantastic. I think will ultimately compete for a depth role if the Lions decide to bring him back, sort of, I would say, on a 1-year, short-term, light deal for both parties. Then you have wide receiver Allen Robinson, who sort of took the role that I saw Donovan Peoples-Jones filling, and then obviously Tim Patrick sort of filled in there admirably as well. So again, it depends on how the Lions want to move forward in the wide receiver room. You know, Johnny Morton coming in as a former wide receiver coach, so he's going to have a lot of say in how that room moves forward. I don't know if I see Allen Robinson coming back. I think the Lions could move on either through the draft or finding a free agent piece that they're comfortable with on a 1-year deal. Now moving on to two players who I think are in a similar position, both linebackers, Ezekiel Turner and Ben Niemann, who in their own right fill great in depth roles, but were asked to do a lot of different things towards the end of the season. Ezekiel Turner made some plays. Ben Niemann, kind of a force on the special team side of things, as well as Turner. And if that's what their ultimate role is, I can see the Lions bringing them back in those depth piece roles. Nose tackle Kyle Pecco, who was another injured loss for the season situation, a guy the Lions liked as their depth behind some of their defensive linemen. And again, in a situation where you're not asking much of Pecco as a depth piece, if he's willing to come back on a short-term deal at the right price, I think they like him. He's a veteran presence along with Pat O'Connor. I think both those guys sort of serve similar purposes, and I think they like Pecco over O'Connor. So again, if the price is right, I could see them bringing him back. On the edge, El Kadeen Muhammad, which I thought he made several plays in tough positions here. We know the Lions were ravaged up front on their defensive line at edge, and he was really the only guy to produce when they weren't getting much from Zadarius Smith. So I think that's a guy you definitely bring back as a depth piece. Again, he's not going to require much. I think it'll be a short-term deal, the right money on a guy that you know has a huge motor and can make plays. Then the commish, defensive lineman John Kaminsky, and unfortunately he did not play a snap this past season, but the Lions love him and we're expecting a lot of good things, assuming they had a healthy defensive line. I think it's not going to cost much to bring him back, and he's really going to want to prove himself in 2025. So I think that is certainly a guy they bring back next year. On the opposite end, cornerback Kindle Vildor. I think that's a guy that, although he filled in well, asking a lot of him in the previous seasons, and I think he's really marred by what happened in the NFC Championship game with the football off the helmet. But I think now the Lions will have enough depth at cornerback where that's a guy they can move on from. Defensive lineman Pat O'Connor. We just talked about the defensive lineman and sort of the other purpose for Kyle Pecco and what John Kaminsky could bring back to the table. Well, Pat O'Connor, another guy who came from Tampa Bay, has a veteran experience they like, and really it comes down to what's the right price for some of these players and how do they fit into the scheme that Kelvin Shepard's looking to run. I like Pat O'Connor, but if it's between him and Kaminsky or him and Pecco, I think he would fall off in that situation. Cornerback Khalil Dorsey, who we know had the horrific injury towards the end of the season, but they love him on special teams. I think the question will be, does the injury hinder them from re-signing him? It could be a long-term recovery. He might not be ready for the start of next season. And if that's the case, are the Lions willing to hold a roster spot for him? But I know they like him. They know the upside that he provides, especially on special teams. So if the price is right, I think he comes back. This is probably the toughest one to go over. Dan Skipper, the offensive tackle. We know Skip. We know the Lions organization loves him, and he's very versatile. But I think the Lions have a lot of pieces they like depth-wise on the offensive line, and will that supersede them then giving Dan Skipper a contract? I think they do bring him back. I think there's still enough good faith in him there, what he can do as an extra lineman, so on and so forth. So I do expect Dan Skipper to come back. Now the edge, Marcus Davenport, who was supposed to be the answer on the opposite end of Aiden Hutchinson. Well, we know that all fell apart with Davenport's early on injury, then obviously Aiden Hutchinson with the bad leg injury in Dallas. I don't think Marcus Davenport comes back. I think that was a low risk, high reward, and I don't blame them for it. I think if Davenport stays healthy, it could have meant a lot of good things for the defensive line for the Lions, but that didn't happen. And with his track record of injuries, I don't think the Lions take another shot on him, so I do see him leaving the organization. And another guy that has an unfortunate injury history that I think will play against him here this offseason is safety Ife Melifonwu, who played such a vital role at the end of 2023 and part of 2024, but he just has not been able to remain healthy, and we know what the Lions' depth looks like at safety. They're going to have to deal with long-term contracts for probably both Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph, so that I think makes Melifonwu the odd man out. And another tough one to call, wide receiver Tim Patrick. We talked about the other wide receivers that I think may fall off. Well, Tim Patrick is the guy you really have to consider. And I think a lot of this will play into what Johnny Morton sees for his offense in that wide receiver room. You know you have Amon-Ra St. Brown. You know you have the speedy Jamison Williams. You have Khalif Raymond. You have some other pieces there. Well, the X-wide receiver, which we talked about so much this last offseason, is where Tim Patrick sort of filled that role. And again, this is a very much so a Price is Right situation. If he's willing to come back, he has a little bit of injury history. Did he get enough statistic-wise this season where some teams will offer him a bigger contract? If that's the case, I think the Lions can move on and maybe look to the draft or look to another free agent to fill that role. But I think we all like Tim Patrick, and I'd like to see him come back. Next up, linebacker Derek Barnes, who was injured week 3 against Arizona, and I think could have been a casualty with the fact that Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator, was leaving the organization. But the fact that the Lions hired from within with Kelvin Shepard, who's so familiar and was mentored by Aaron Glenn, I don't think a lot will change schematically. And the Lions like to use that Sam linebacker role where Derek Barnes really seems to fit. He can rush the passer. He's decent in pass protect or in defending the pass, so he can serve a lot of purposes. But they just didn't get or see enough of him this last season to know what they'll have in years to come. I think they have enough familiarity with him, and the fact that the scheme may stay the same bodes well. So I think Derek Barnes will return. Defensive lineman Levi Onwuzurike, who actually remained healthy in 2024 after his first 3 seasons, which were just destroyed by injuries in the back and all of those issues. And I think there may have been more for him this year if the rest of the defensive line had stayed healthy, if the rest of the defense had remained healthy. I think that would have given him so much more opportunity to show production, but they just didn't get that. And they needed more out of him this year in a case where they didn't have other players and they expected so much from him, and he just hasn't shown up. And I think because of that, the price is going to be too much for the Lions to justify bringing him back. So unfortunately, I can see Levi leaving the organization. Now the right guard, Kevin Zeitler, who was a big free agent acquisition for the Lions the last offseason and filled the Jonah Jackson departure role at guard, and I thought he filled in really well. more than really well. The Lions maintain one of the best offensive lines, if not the best offensive line in football when they were healthy. And I think he was even better than the opposite guard, Graham Glasgow. And that's really the question. Are the Lions willing to pay another one-year deal? I don't think you give him a multiple-year deal because of his age. And because of some injuries that had popped up. But if he's willing to come back on another one-year deal and the price is right, I absolutely would bring him back. I would then promote Christian Mahogany to the other guard or switch that around to where Graham Glasgow is now your depth piece at center and at guard.
Former DB, who's the best DB you've played against?
For me, I'll say Carlton Davis.
Wow.
The only reason why I say Carlton Davis because he was longer than I expected, you know what I'm saying? Longer arms.
Longer,
and
okay.
He ain't got no knee bend. He just
He's a
hunched
Gumby.
his back over and just played defense, you know what I'm saying? So I think I played him twice too. So, you know, he made some good plays on me, so I ain't gonna never forget that one.
Wow. And last but not least, of course, Carlton Davis. And I thought he filled in so well, and it was exactly what the Lions needed at a cornerback one this year. And as long as he was healthy, he was the perfect fit for the Lions and Aaron Glenn's defense. And moving forward, again, with Kelvin Shepherd filling in that familiarity role, I expect that Carlton Davis could play that same role again. I think the only knock on Carlton Davis is that he was again injured this year. We know what's up with the jaw. Does that allow him to start next season, or is there a delay to him coming back? But if the Lions are comfortable with that, if they like where his rehab is at, they certainly like the production on the field. He's got the length, he's got the speed, he's willing to come up and tackle and play in the run game. There's so many good things about Carlton Davis, and then they can continue to build the depth behind him with the young guys, Terrion Arnold, Linus Rakestraw, and what I would expect to be other talent brought in at cornerback. So again, I think the Lions, if they're willing to spend the money, if the price is right for the right amount of years, I would not go longer than 2 years for Carlton Davis. I would bring him back.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
That's going to do it through my list of Detroit Lions free agents as we head into 2025. Did I hit on them all? Who would you say will stay? And who do you think should go? Let me know down in the comments. I appreciate you guys hanging around these videos. If you dig the vibe here at Johnny Gaz Sports, please hit that like button. It's the best free way to help out the channel. I'd also love it if you consider subscribing. We're on the road to 3,000 now, thanks to you guys. And if you hit the notify bell, you won't miss any future videos. There's a membership option available. That's where I do my live game play-by-plays, a ton of other fun stuff. But there's always free content here for you all the time. More than anything else, take care of yourself and that mental health. It's so important. I want to make sure you come back and see me on future videos. Have a fantastic rest of the week ahead. Go Lions.